Do you know, sometimes I feel that like sprockets and chains on e-bikes are a little bit like teeth in your mouth. If you don't brush your teeth, if you don't oil your chain, it'll cost you a lot of money. So today then, let's have a look on how to maximize your chain life. Right, before we start, I want to point out there are actually e-bike specific chains on the market, just like this KMC one, which is coming up on screen now, or a Shimano one, or indeed a SRAM chain. Now this is an EX1 chain because it actually says so on the chain. I want to point out that this is actually a e-bike specific drivetrain on this bike. So you might be asking, what makes it e-bike specific? Well, we're talking in general thicker chains, thicker cogs, and a generally more robust group set on your e-mountain bike. Right, first up, let's talk some general maintenance of your e-bike chain. Now, I know we're all different in our levels of maintenance, not only in terms of brushing your teeth, but also in oiling your chain. But you must make sure that after every single e-bike ride, you oil your chain to make sure that system is running as smoothly as possible, because it does ultimately affect how the motor performs too. So after every ride, you need to, depending on the nature of the ride, if it's a super messy ride, take the chain off, chuck it in a pot, get the degreaser on it, take the chain back out to there, dry it off and lube it up before putting it back on your e-bike. Now, if you look at the component parts of just one chain length, you've got rollers, pins and plates. So if there's grit on each of those parts, that's going to massively increase the friction and the wear on that chain. That's generally going to slow down your e-bike. Not a good thing at all. Right, what are we going to use then to keep this system running sweet? Well, I think there's three main components. You've got some degreaser, which I mentioned earlier. You're going to put your chain in a pot after a particularly messy ride, so you can use that to clean it off. And then you've actually got two different types of lube. You've got a dry lube and you've got a wet lube. Now, the wet lube is thicker and it's particularly good for wet conditions. However, it does tend to attract a little bit more dirt than the dry lube, which is good for obviously dry conditions, but the dry lube doesn't tend to last quite as long as the wet lube. I think the point here when it comes to general maintenance, it's all about routines. Make sure you do it after every single e-bike ride, because I promise you, I totally promise you, the e-bike will be running so much more efficient if you do so. And it's a bit like just checking your tire pressures. Get used to doing it after every ride or before going on every ride. So there's actually a reason why these little links get worn, and that's primarily due to stretching and wear due to grit coming into the system. However, there's other reasons too, and that's because of the higher torque levels involved in an e-bike. Say, for example, the motor's producing 250 watts, and also you yourself are producing 250 watts too. So sometimes you could be going for an hour to 2 hour ride, and you don't actually stop spinning the pedals on your e-bike. So it's really important, therefore, to check the chain wear on your e-mountain bike. And to do that, you use a simple tool called a chain checker tool. So it's very easy to use. You place it on top between one gap and another, and then you check on this. So if it's between 0 and 5, then your chain is good. If it's between 5 and 7, then it's probably not too bad. We should be thinking about changing it. And then if you get up to 0.7, then you need to totally get rid of that chain. Right, so the big question is, how often do you check for chain wear on your e-mountain bike? Well, this bike, for example, has had one care floaner on top of the maintenance, and this particular person has actually checked the chain every single month on the bike, which I think is a good recommendation. But this bike, after 6 months of very careful use, as I said, is now only down to about between 0.5 and 0.7, so it's probably time to get rid of that chain. So one question we get asked quite frequently is, do you actually change the chain and cassette together, or do you run two chains? Well, we think the two chain option is really good. Obviously, it depends on how often you ride your e-mountain bike, but if you ride it really frequently, we suggest you swap that chain out every single week and make sure the chain that comes off gets a really good degreasing and lubing and is fresh to go on for your next week's ride. So there you go, swapping chains out every week can actually save you from a particularly expensive cassette bill, because those EX cassettes are about €400. What can also save you money is actually your method of shifting. Now, the EX system actually only shifts one cog at a time. That means you're not going to be smashing through a load of gears, because remember, it's not only your shifting, your manual shifting that's involved. There's the power of that motor, especially when you add that to multiple shifts, it's going to really grind through those gears. So I think the message here is actually try not to shift under power. But one more thing as well, which I really want to point out, is that very often the rear wheel on your e-bike can work loose because, as I said, you might be riding for 1 to 2 hours, pedaling frantically over rocks and everything. So if your rear wheel comes loose, that's going to put a tilt on that cassette, and that's going to affect how the chain engages on those teeth. And sometimes you can actually break the teeth off. So that's not a good look on your e-mountain bike. Which brings us on then to our final point, and that is the pre-ride bolt check. And the main ones to look out for are your lock ring bolt here, then you've got your axle, your derailleur hanger, and also your derailleur bolt there. Now it's really important maybe to use a torque wrench when you're doing these nuts and bolts, because if you look on the bike here, there's actually settings for each one. So I've got a 2 Newton meters on here, then I've got a 40 Newton meters on the lock ring. They're all different and require you to tighten them with different forces. Moving up to the front of the bike, don't forget there's bolts up there as well. You've got your chainring bolts. So all these, if any of these come loose, that's gonna put a tilt on the system and really wear out your chain way too early. So that's it. I think that should keep you rolling smoothly. And I think there's actually 4 general things to bear in mind. The first thing is routine maintenance. Don't forget to get on it as soon as you get back from your ride. Number 2 is to check the wear on your chain, and you can do that with that chain tool, which I mentioned earlier. 3 is making sure you're getting good shifting technique on your e-bike. And finally, it's checking those nuts and bolts, as I mentioned a minute earlier. Don't forget, you can leave your comments below, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of comments relating to getting most out of your chain life. Don't forget you can subscribe to eMBN, but if you want to stay with us, there's a great video that Doddy did on how to get the best shifting from your e-mountain bike, and this one from Chris on common e-mountain bike problems. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up.